Okay, so welcome to the presentation promoting positive school climate through comprehensive program planning. Oops. We're so excited for you all to be here with us this afternoon. We are going to go through a deep dive in this session today about how to do comprehensive prevention programs in schools. So this is something myself, our entire school climate and prevention team is so passionate about, is getting the word of prevention out, but also how we go through really looking at what that means and how it goes beyond just programs for students, but we really start looking at the entire school environment, the entire school climate. So we are going to go pretty deep in that today. We will get into the weeds of it all, but that is something that I'm so excited to share with you, and hopefully we can share it in a way that it seems like a pretty easy process that you can go back and implement in your school building. So just so you are aware ahead of time, we will be sharing all of our slides. We will be sharing all of our resources. So we have a ton of links embedded right here into this presentation. I will walk you through how to use a few of those links, but I highly encourage you to go back after this presentation, click on the links and see how it works for your school and walk through this process either with your team or for yourself in your classroom. Okay, so we're going to first start off with introductions. So if you all wouldn't mind going in the chat and typing your name and what school you are from or what your position is within that school, we just want to know who all is here with us who today, and to be able to provide you with more of those resources. So I will start off. My name is Elizabeth Suddeth. I'm the Executive Director of Prevention Services at the School Climate Transformation at the State Department of Education. I've been with the State Department for about 4 years now, and prevention is my passion. It is what I've done the most in school buildings. I have taught comprehensive prevention programming. So when we relate it to our school climate transformation and our school climate transformation grant, I'll go through here in just a moment with you. It is just the whole picture of how we can meet the needs of the whole child. So again, excited to go through that information with you. Now I will pitch it over to Amanda Sellers and let her introduce herself to you.
Hello, and thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Amanda Sellers. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I am a school climate specialist that works on the school climate grant within student support. Primarily, I serve the Northeast region of Oklahoma. I have been working with sites and districts for the last 6 years on implementation of multi-tiered systems of support. Very passionate about systems implementation and really kind of what prevention looks like in there. Anyways, I'm glad to be here today and looking forward to the conversations and participation.
Great, thank you, Mandy. Okay, so first to start off with, I'm going to do a basic overview of what our office that we are in. So Mandy and I are both in the Office of Student Support, and Student Support is a new office that was formed in just the last couple of years at the State Department. And we get the privilege of being able to exist as just a resource to schools. So that is my favorite part about this job, my favorite part about this office, and really working at the agency is how we're able to provide resources, we're able to provide training, we're able to provide one-on-one coaching with schools on a wide variety of needs. So student support is really everything that you would think of that is non-academic or non-curricula related. So we provide a holistic approach to supporting educators through academic school counseling guidance, and academic guidance is in our office. Alternative education is also in our office, as well as college and career readiness, social emotional learning, and family and community engagement, as well as prevention and school climate transformation. So if you find yourself in need for any of those resources, please feel free to reach out to us. You have our contact information in these slides. We are more than happy to either come out and provide training to your school, to your district, or to just provide you with resources or give you some ideas or give some technical assistance around any of these topics. So a little bit more detail about school climate transformation. So a school climate transformation team was actually formed through a grant through the U.S. Department of Education. So within this grant, we are able to do two different things. One, we're able to coach a cohort of schools on multi-tiered system of support for behavior. We're also embedding social emotional learning training through that. We're embedding comprehensive school climate training, prevention training. We're able to do a lot of things and with that one-on-one coaching with that cohort of grant schools. And we're seeing some really great results and some really great model sites that we cannot wait to share with the rest of the state. Something that the second lane that we're able to do with this grant is provide statewide technical assistance to anybody. So we set up the state into 9 different regions, and our team consists of 4 specialists who are able to provide training and technical assistance to anybody in their region. So you can see the names listed here of our specialists in the regions that they are correlated to. So again, please feel free to email Mandy or I, and we're more than happy to get you in contact with your regional specialist if you would like to see any more of the trainings or anything that I have listed so far. Okay, so like I said, just a basic overview, and now I am going to pitch it over to Mandy, and she's going to go into a little bit more detail of what do we mean by school climate. Oftentimes, that is the first question I am asked, and it is not related to weather, but I will let Mandy go into a little bit more detail of what do we mean by school climate, what do we mean by positive school environment.
Well, and Elizabeth, I'm glad you said that, because sometimes that is the question we get. Are you talking about the climate, like the environment, the weather? But that is not what school climate is. But what school climate is, it's really an equitable school climate that supports each student's path to those pro-social identities. It's being culturally responsive to those patterns and a wide range of norms, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, leadership practices, and organizational structures within the school and broader community. That is how school climate is defined. Go ahead. And the first thing I want to kind of, when we talk about school climate, the way that the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environment defines it through their model is it's that engagement piece, the safety piece, and the environment. When we think safety, we think emotional and physical safety. Those are 2 things that we also address when we're talking about a school system that is being trauma informed, is that school system is both emotionally and physically safe. The engagement is that relationship piece. What's the relationships between students to educators to peer, co-worker to co-worker? What's our relationships with our families? It's also what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like? How are we engaging in those practices in our school environment? It's also the participation. And when we talk about school participation, I just want to kind of identify there, that means the school community being how your families, your community businesses, your travel agencies, everything interacts together. The other thing is the environment. That is that physical, academic environment, and of course the mental wellness of our students, the mental wellness of our staff, and the discipline practices. So those are the 3 things, as we reference school climate, we want to keep in mind. So in everything that we do, we want to make sure that we're being equitable with those services and practices. So an equitable school climate is defined by effectively supporting high expectations for the teaching and learning and achievement. Again, it's that emotional and physical safety. It's a caring, courageous, and self-reflective relationships. It's those healthy relationships between our peers and adults. And it's culturally responsive pathways to participation, which are meaningful and enhance academic, social, emotional, civic, and moral development. That is how we define an equitable school climate. So one of the things when we talk about school climate is very multifaceted. It involves many aspects of the educational experience, and school climate has been defined in a number of ways. But one of the things that we hear is, what is school climate and what is school culture, and how are the 2 defined? The best way we like to frame it is school climate is that attitude, and school culture is the personality. when we talk about school culture being the personality, we know that there are certain personality traits that we have with us our whole life. However, our attitude can shift and change, but we know that the two correlate, and they go back and forth. One drives and determines the other. So school climate is those patterns of norms, goals, values, interpersonal relationships, leadership practices, and organizational structures in the school, where school culture is sometimes that written and unwritten rules that shape and influence aspects of school's function. I kind of, sometimes the way that I define school culture is it's what's not said. It's what people aren't saying. What are those nonverbals? What are those reactions that we're hearing? That school culture is the attitudes about the school community. It's the spoken and unspoken feelings of the comfort and safety. It's the policies and daily practices. Where school climate is the positive expectations for staff and students. It's the quality of those interpersonal relationships. It's where all students have equitable access. So those are some things when we think school climate, we think school culture, and sometimes they're referred to interchangeably. These are how they're defined. And why is it important? So why is it important that we attend to school climate? Because here's what we know, and here's what research tells us, and here's just what we know by good practice, that students learn best when they are in an environment in which they feel safe, supported, challenged, and accepted. It's the same way with myself. I practice best, I work best in an environment where I feel safe and supported and challenged. If I came into work every day and Elizabeth, I'm going to pick on her. She's a wonderful director, but if she was always or yelling about something or upset, it would be very difficult to perform and function at my best. However, since she's not, and she's very open and listens, it's that positive relationship that we've developed that helps us be effective in our work. So we know that strengthening the school climate, including conditions for learning, can help boost student achievement and close those achievement gaps. It increases attendance. It decreases teacher turnover, increases teacher satisfaction, and it improves the school safety and student morale. So when we talk about prevention services and implementing prevention programs to enhance school climate, what I want everyone to keep in mind is that prevention it's that core piece. It's the thing that we do in our environment daily to help prevent those negative outcomes. Specifically, it's prevention efforts that we put in place reduce the risk of negative health outcomes, whether those are social, emotional, behavioral, physical health outcomes. And there is a difference. So just to as we go along here, let's go ahead and identify what those differences are between intervention and prevention. Prevention, which is also called health promotion, it again is those efforts that we put in place in our school system or in our environment that helps reduce the risk of negative health outcomes. It's the efforts that we often focus on multi-level public health approaches to create and contribute to the occurrence of negative health outcomes. So an example of this is those teaching healthy relationships, teaching positive coping strategies, teaching about the outcomes of substance use or abuse, where intervention is if something has occurred. At this point, if it's a crisis, if an issue is occurring, we are responding, we're intervening. And these efforts aim to help the individual so the impact of the crisis or the issue is as little as possible. So referring someone who has experienced dating violence, again, that's that response, it's that intervention, that's that service to treatment. Did I miss anything there? I just want to make sure I kind of define that correctly, Elizabeth. So if there's anything that I missed, feel free to jump in.
No, I think that you hit on everything there, Mandy. I think we just need schools to know that there is a difference between prevention and intervention. And I think that is why prevention oftentimes takes this team approach, and we look at school climate as the overall approach of the school, because intervention typically falls on either one person, either the school counselor or the teacher who is intervening in a situation, but prevention really takes everybody. It really takes the entire school community. Prevention is a completely different level, and it takes completely different planning than what you would plan for interventions for students. Just so we recognize, even in our classrooms, even if you say, well, this is in my classroom and I'm not sitting on a team making these decisions for the entire school, we can see prevention being implemented in the classroom as well. So how are you planning for some of those prevention strategies, just like you would plan for intervention strategies? I know when I'm going to refer to the office. I know when there are situations that I can handle inside my classroom. There's a lot of planning that really goes into effective interventions. And the point of this is just that we have the same amount of planning that goes into prevention, because we know the more we invest in prevention, the less we're going to have to invest in interventions. You're going to have way more time to focus on prevention. You're going to have way more time to implement some of those strategies if you're not spending all of your time on intervention. So yes, Mandy, I think you hit on it all. And I think we have a perfect story coming up to illustrate the difference between the two as well.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that, because I think our next slide kind of illustrates what we're trying to say in terms of prevention is it's tier 1. So when we talk intervention at tier 2 and tier 3 within a multi-tiered system of support, students who are receiving tier 2 and tier 3 supports should still be receiving those good prevention practices. And I like the way that this triangle kind of lays out, because it shows, hey, tier 1 is all, it continues, it does not stop when a student receives tier 2 or tier 3 support. We know that prevention happens in academics. It happens in social emotional behavior. We know that what we see in the classrooms when we're teaching reading, there are some good prevention things that are put in place so that not every kiddo would have to receive reading interventions. And it's the same way when we talk about social emotional behavioral supports. And really, again, it goes back to what we referenced in the beginning. Prevention is attending to that whole child. It's academics, behavior, social emotional, everything coming together in a multi-tiered system of support that attends to the whole child. And that's really where we want to make that connection piece, is schools that are embedding prevention within their multi-tiered system of support are really functioning at that best practice. And what Elizabeth's going to go into is really selecting a good evidence-based program or curriculum that aligns well within your MTSS system.
And Mandy, just in case we have people on here who aren't familiar as much with an MTSS, will you just break down what each tier represents?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you said that. So, you know what? I think on a few more slides, there's a nice little, and I'll let you just go ahead and forward to that.
There was once.
Sorry,
Mandy, I'll let you get there when we get there.
I'll go back. Just to kind of let you guys know that tier 1 is really universal. We're looking at those universal supports that are for 80 and 90%. That's usually, that's for all students in all settings. Tier 2 is those targeted interventions. That's for some, that 10 to 15%. And tier 3 is that few 1 to 5%, which is those individualized interventions. Those are our kiddos that are more high risk at failing. But again, I want to make the connection that a kiddo that's receiving tier 3 supports is also receiving tier 2 and tier 1 supports. So very good. I'm glad you said that. Okay. You can't talk about prevention and intervention without a really good quote. And as Benjamin Franklin says, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So basically, intervention without prevention does not address the root problem. And when we talk about multi-tiered systems of support and school climate, if you're not attending to those root issues, you're not addressing things at that preventative level, then you're doing a lot of reaction. And I got a video. I brought a video with us to show about what that looks like.
There was once a carpenter that lived by a river in the village near you. Every day, with his trusty hammer, he built boats out of wood. One day, as the carpenter was working, he looked out onto the river and saw a child trying to swim towards the shore. "Help," said the child. "The current is too strong." So the carpenter grabbed a boat and rescued the child. "How did you get into the river?" asked the carpenter. "I fell in upstream," said the child. The next day, when the carpenter looked out onto the river, he saw two children struggling to swim towards the shore. "Help," the children said. The carpenter called out to another villager, and together they rescued the children. But the next day, there were 5 children, and the next day, there were a dozen, and soon the whole village was busy rescuing children from the river. The villagers grew weary, and some of the boats started to leak and break from overuse. The carpenter worked tirelessly to repair them, but as the number of children in the river grew, soon there weren't even enough boats to get the job done. One day, the carpenter asked himself a question. Why and how are so many children falling into the river in the first place? So he bravely ran upstream to find out. There, he saw a big, windy village with many houses, and some of the houses were in a state of disrepair. And when the wind blew especially hard, the houses creaked and cracked, and things were swept out of them and into the nearby river. Sometimes what was swept up was children. The carpenter saw an old lady walking by. "Excuse me," he said to the old lady, "tell me, why are these houses so broken down? Why aren't these houses stronger?" "The people of this village want to fix these houses so that they can resist the wind," the old lady replied. "But we do not have the tools to do so, and the wind lately has been especially strong." "I can help," said the carpenter. And with the help of the old lady, he gathered the villagers, gave them his hammer, and taught them how to use it so that they could learn to make their houses strong when the wind blew especially hard and keep their children from falling into the river.
Yay!
Because you see, if we make the effort to go upstream and help build strong foundations there, we won't need to work so hard to rescue children downstream. There was once a carpenter that
Well, let us get back. There we go. So prevention, simply put, is an upstream solution. It's taking the time to pause and say, how can we best use our resources? How can we be most effective? Let's go up the stream and let's see what we can do within our school system to not only rescue our students, but our families and our school community. In a time where trauma is very prevalent, we're coming out of some very difficult times. We're in a recovery and a response mode. We've been in response mode this last year. This is the time to pause and reflect and say, what can we do differently within our whole school at a prevention level that's going to help us in that long term? So we're not jumping in and using all of our resources. That takes its toll and creates burnout, unfortunately, within our staff and educators. So equity and education, as we go forward and we're talking in terms of multi-tiered systems of support and what prevention looks like, again, it's that equitable approach. It's for all. This gives us the opportunity to say this is where each and every student in the community is invited and welcome into a system of teaching and learning that is fluid, responsive, dynamic, and alive, and uses all available resources to meet student needs. We switch from response to prevent. Just to say, when we talk about multi-tiered systems of support and those tiered areas as in terms of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, MTSS is not a program. It is a framework. So when you think of framework, you think, hey, this is how the whole school does it. But in your classroom, when you build out that classroom and you build out those walls, the decoration looks a little bit different. So within each school system or classroom, it can be implemented differently. It's not cookie cutter. It is very much a framework. Just to kind of define, so why do we practice multi-tiered system support? Because And the Every Student Succeed Act multi-tiered systems of support is a comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students' needs with regular observation to facilitate database instructional decision-making. So again, it comes out of good research and it comes out of policy. And most recently in Oklahoma, not only did we say, hey, this is something that we need to, that's practiced federally wide, that's not only something we're implementing with our school systems, but Governor and Stitt actually signed on April 23rd of this year, pre-service teacher preparation programs that require teacher candidates in early childhood, elementary and secondary, and special education to study the philosophy and framework, components, and implementation of multi-tiered systems of support to address core academic and non-academic needs of students. So what we know is MTSS is a way to do education. It's a way to do business. When we reference MTSS for the remainder of this presentation, we could be talking about that response to intervention, positive behavior interventions and supports, interconnected systems framework, and I apologize I didn't write another one on there, but we may be talking about that social emotional learning component as well. And it's important to remember that this MTSS derived out of a public health model for organizing systems, and it's how those classrooms and schools are structured. And I would not be good at my job if I didn't show you the triangle more than once. So you have to see the triangle at least twice in our presentations. Again, it's that 80 to 90% is that all. Some is 10 to 15, few is 1 to 5%. And when you see that bottom line there, that's when we are talking in terms of responding to trauma, it's realizing the prevalence of trauma, it's recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, it's responding in a restorative practices, and it's resisting within our structures and organizations re-traumatization of the students, staff, and family members.
And just so you're aware, for the remainder of this presentation, we're really going to be living in that all section. So in that tier 1 section. So even though it says on this screen, 80 to 90% of students, 100% of students either in your classroom or your school will be receiving tier 1. That 80-90% refers to the level, it means that 80 to 90% of your students will only need tier 1. So they will respond to that primary prevention. We want to build up protective factors. We want to build up those preventative measures before we reach the need of needing some of those interventions like you would see in the rest of the support that you would provide. So 80-90% of students will respond and will only need tier 1, but 100% of your school will receive that instruction. And that's where you really embed those prevention programs. That's where you embed these practices to make sure that every single student in your building is receiving this level of support, not just the students who haven't experienced any negative health behaviors or risk behaviors, but even those students as well, because everybody needs to receive this information.
And just like Elizabeth said, I'm so glad she kind of outlined that. We're going to live in that this prevent. So when we talk about those evidence-based practices, oftentimes we find ourselves in response. So we're all the way over to the right, which means that we effectively respond to behaviors and gaps in learning by providing additional support. But often that's a tool that gets overused. Again, we go back to our story about the carpenter and all the kiddos in the river. Those were response methods. We're going to go all the way over and we're going to say, hey, let's use more tools in our toolbox. Let's talk about this prevention. That's maximizing the structures and increasing engagement in that social, emotional, academic learning. That's the majority. Is there anything you think that we want to just make sure we lay the foundation before you start, we start going forward and taking everyone through some of the tasks?
I think that pretty much covers it up, where we're going to live right in that prevent area, but really think back to your training and think back to you know, what you received going into the school. And I know Mandy just said this, but a lot of times we live and respond. I know when I had my classroom management training, or I had any class or any training before I went into the classroom, it was, how was I going to respond to misbehavior? How was I going to respond when a student reaches out to me? How am I going to respond when XYZ happens? And a lot of times we forget all of the things that lead up to respond. So when we're focusing on prevention, we're taking it back to the very beginning. We're taking it back to building it up so we have less response and less responses needed later on, because we have built up more prevention. And as we just showed on that triangle as well, 80 to 90% of your students will have their needs met by that prevent level, by that tier 1 level. And something else I know, Mandy, you just pointed this out, but that I want to make sure we really focus on is that there are external factors that are outside of our control, especially students coming into our building every single day, especially in this last year. We have a lot of students coming in, and Mandy, as you referred to, we're in recovery mode. We're in, we just went through the storm and we're coming out of that storm. And what does that look like? It looks so different for every single student. It looks so different for every single staff member in your building. It's going to look different in your classroom. So we want to make sure and recognize that there are so many factors that are out of your control, but the more we can build up these prevention factors, the more we can build up these tier 1 supports, then that is more control back into your classroom and more support back to the students, more focus on recovery instead of just constantly putting out fires.
You know, and that's great, Elizabeth, because that's exactly what we're saying here, is that we can't control all those external factors. I mean, I think if anything, this last year was definitely an eye opener to that. But what we can do is set up our system where it is consistent, it is welcoming, there's healthy relationships going on. I mean, those are those in the pocket prevention things that we have and we practice every day. And so when we talk about those external factors, let's also focus on what we can do in our building, and that's that consistency piece. So I'm so glad you said that. So the next slide just kind of recaps everything before we go into, is basically saying that prevention is that main structural piece. It is the piece that helps us build a sustainable, positive school climate. It's the bridge, or it's the houses that are very well structured that keeps the kiddos from falling through the cracks. And not just the kiddos, but it keeps us as staff members from falling through the cracks in our families. And prevention is accessible to everyone. All students should have access to that prevention piece. Okay, so
just like to say, we all live in Oklahoma, and I'm sorry for the triggering picture on this slide that we are all experiencing everywhere across every highway in Oklahoma. But yes, that is what we're here to help build build that bridge to prevention.
And just if we're going to pause real quick, if anyone has any questions or there's anything from the chat, go ahead and drop that in the chat. I know we've got some team members that are moderating that. I'm going to be good and give my moment of pause.
Okay, great. I think we will move on now to the prevention program guide. And yes, we do have the rest of our team who's moderating the chat. So if any questions come up for you as we walk through this is about to be an interactive piece to the session. Now, before you log off, I'm not going to make you all speak. But I do want you all to really see how to use these links, see how to program guide or program plan. So we will be doing a few activities through the rest of this session as well. Okay, so this prevention program planning guide, if you were in Blair and Jenna's social emotional learning session this morning, then you saw them mention that this prevention program planning guide is coming. So this is something that we're going through the final approval process right now, and hopefully we'll have to you all before school starts. But every single thing that you are about to see in this presentation is going to be encompassed list in this guide. So you won't have to write down everything you see or keep referring back to these slides. We will have this released for you all, and it is in a step-by-step, task-by-task process. So as I mentioned before, you can either work on this as a school team, which is recommended and which is best practice, or you can work on this for your own classroom. This is a very versatile tool, and we want to make sure that it meets the needs, that you can focus on a positive environment in your classroom, even if that's not something that's happening school-wide or district-wide at the moment. So there is a lot of evidence behind this prevention program planning guide, and I'll go into a little bit of the research here on the next slide. But like I said, this is really a tool that is just going to walk you through how do you really program plan? How do we make sure we have effective programs in place? And we're not just throwing programs and hoping that they stick and hoping that we see student outcomes. One of the things that I hear the most going into schools, or one of the things that I feel the most even working previously in schools, is when we talk about school climate. Mandy did such a good job talking about school climate and culture. We all know exactly what that feeling is. We all know what that feeling is as soon as we walk into schools. And as soon as we start communicating with our peers or our coworkers, and we start going through the day, there's schools that I've worked in before that I can just feel the pressure walking in. And I've had a lot of conversations, and I've been on the side that I just felt like I was putting out fires all day long. And I knew there was another answer. I knew we had to have something in place that I didn't just constantly feel like it was one thing after another after another. And that's really where I fell in love with prevention, and prevention became my passion. You can probably hear it when I'm talking about it. I probably talk about prevention a little too much when it comes to schools, but it really became an answer for me. It became an answer to what I was seeing in the classroom. It became an answer to feeling less overwhelmed. And the more I felt less overwhelmed, the more my coworkers felt less overwhelmed, the more we started having a positive team. We started having a positive interactions. We started having more positive interactions with our students. And over time, that started shifting the school climate. And that's where prevention is really just so important to an overall comprehensive school climate and transforming that school environment. So like I said, there is research involved in this. We didn't just make up this guide. We actually base it on the strategic prevention framework. So again, like I said, as soon as I was trained in prevention, started going through this process, this is one of the first areas that I was trained on and that I started working to build prevention programs. So what the strategic prevention framework steps through the process, it is actually through SAMHSA. And it is, the first step is assessment. How do we actually identify the needs of our school? And as I said, we stopped just throwing programs out and hoping that they work and hoping that they fix. And you want me to teach this curriculum? You want me to talk about what today? Why are we doing this? There's actually a why behind the programs. There's a why behind my classroom is implementing this, why behind my school who is implementing this. So we really, really focus on assessment and looking at the data and looking at why we're selecting programs. Because you have experts in your school who tell you exactly what they need. And those are your students. Your students know what's going on in the community. Your students know what's going on all around them. They know what's happening in the school way more than we will ever be aware of. They truly are the experts in the field. So we have to be able to tap into their knowledge. We have to be able to ask them, what is happening for you and what do you need? Instead of the approach that I always took, and let me tell you what you need. You need to build up these factors. We're actually looking at student need. So the second step is capacity. How do we build resources and readiness to address prevention needs? So how do we look at what we're going to need? How do we look at teams that we might want to develop in the school? It's really about building the infrastructure. So as Mandy showed that that slide of building a house, this is the part where we're gathering all of our tools to build the house. We know that it's going to look completely different from one classroom to another because you have completely different students from one classroom to another, but we want to make sure that you have the capacity there. So step 3 that we will go through is planning. So like I was mentioning, the difference between prevention and intervention, you plan for intervention, you plan for lesson plans, you plan your curriculum. It's the same steps for planning your prevention. Where is this embedded? And it's not a separate step. So you can do all 3 of those things at the same time. That's the most beautiful thing about prevention, about social emotional learning, about all of these topics, is you can embed them right into your instruction. You can embed them right into existing lesson plans. But we have to have planning before that to do so. So step 4 is implementation. So this is actually where you go in and implement. Step 5, evaluation. So step 5 is so important because we want to make sure what we're doing is actually working. How do we evaluate our programs? How do we evaluate what we're actually doing and making sure it is effective for our students? We don't want to keep doing programs that aren't working, because that's when we have staff burnout. That's when we have students who roll their eyes at the lesson. I've definitely had that many times. I'm sure you all know that as well. We want to make sure, again, that it's working, and then we go through the steps all over again. And that's why it's in this cycle that you see. Okay, so the rest of the presentation, we're going to go step by step how you do each one of these things. So there are 2 critical components of prevention that we must discuss first. The first being cultural sensitivity. You know your community, you know your school, and you know your students. A lot of times, SEL programs or prevention programs will come in what we know as canned programs, and it's a one size fits all. But what we know is that one size doesn't fit every community. It doesn't fit every culture. So to be culturally sensitive, we have to be able to identify an individual or an organization within the community or within that culture who can look at these programs, who can look at what we are doing, look at our practices, look at our lesson plans, and say, does this fit my context? Does what you're teaching fit in alignment with our culture and what we believe? And we have to make adaptations depending upon cultural sensitivity. We also want to make sure that programs can be sustainable. So we select programs that we know can be implemented and maintained. So not selecting programs that we have just for a short amount of time, or we just have funding right here, but we actually want to embed some of that sustainability in. And we'll go through more about sustainability here in just a few slides. Okay, so Mandy, if you want to go over this technical assistance resource that we have in here.
Yeah, Elizabeth, this is based off of that social ecological model that you were just sharing, where you kind of look at system-wide, how does this impact the student? How does it impact school-wide, family, home, community, and state? I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat here, so bear with me, folks. Let's see if I run into an issue, which is sometimes that happens. What we wanted to do was help schools and help our teams as we're working through that family engagement, family and community engagement piece, and also our student support team in family and community engagement does a phenomenal job and has put together a really great framework that you'll be able to access within the chat as well. But really what this technical assistance piece does is it helps you as a team define and identify what is a family? How do we define a family? Again, it goes back to, we sometimes have those unwritten and unspoken of how we define families. Some people may say a family is more of a nuclear family where we've got traditionally a mom, a dad, 2 siblings. But family nowadays is very diverse. And so we need to sit down sometimes as a team and say, you know what, we define family as grandparents or maybe great grandparents raising their children. We define community as we're really small town and I only have a post office, I have a church, I have one convenience store. So that school community needs to extend beyond to maybe include my tribal members, include some of that. My State Department community, State Department education is always here for those supports. So really identifying, sitting down as a team and saying, how do we define students? Last year, we know that students were virtual. They were in person, they were blended, they were, distance learners. So just taking a moment to define that and putting that down in writing, again, it moves from being that unwritten piece to that written piece. And when you go through and you define those and identify those community stakeholders, you're going to do that through that culturally sensitive lens. You're going to engage in some of those conversations that challenge your biases and those implicit biases to move from that culture that maybe where we weren't seeing as much success to we're open. We're an open environment. We're going to set our students and our families up for success. So that's really what that technical assistance resource is for. It's for your teams. It can be used individually, but I love it for a planning piece. So before you start off on your prevention planning or when you're in that capacity and planning piece, it's a tool to use. Okay, I may have over-explained that, but.
No, that's great. Thank you. No, thank you so much, because it is so important to make sure that we are really looking at community level prevention as well. So sorry if you can hear my dogs, but as is all virtual meetings in the last year and a half or so. Okay, so the first place we're going to start is with assessment. So I went into a lot of detail, I know, on that first slide explaining this, but really it's what data do we need to collect? How do we make sure we are selecting effective programs? And what does that look like for our school or community? So we are actually going to do an activity really quick that we would like for you all, if you all can see my screen. Can you still see? Sorry, Mandy, were you about? Yes, Mandy is putting the link to the Jamboard in the chat. So if you can click on that Jamboard and you can join right here where you can see this activity. And what I would like for each of you to do is to click on a little sticky note and then type out on here, what are some issues that you see occurring in your school or you see occurring in your classroom? How often are you seeing those issues and who are you seeing that is most affected? So it can be anything from bullying to dating violence to needing to build up some resiliency skills to self-management skills for littles. So whatever you are seeing in your school or in your classroom, and then go ahead and type that out. I'll just do an example. So bullying, you'll click save. You can click out of that and then just add it right here on this Jamboard. And I will give you all a couple of minutes just to do that.
And it can also be your virtual classrooms.
Are you all able to access the Jamboard? There we go. Some parents, okay. Self-regulation skills, that's huge. Yes, we're seeing that probably more than ever right now. Compassion towards each other. It's great. Great. Yeah. Okay, I'll give you about 1 or 2 more minutes to add in some more of these comments. Then we'll switch back over to our task planning. Ooh, okay, lack of empathy. I see compassion and empathy coming up a lot on here. I see a lot of student and adult. Low self-esteem. Okay, well, I will let you all keep adding those in. So you don't have to stop now. Please keep adding yours in if you are typing out, but I will switch back over to our slides. So be keeping these things in mind as we switch back over here and continue. Here we go. And continue on with the rest of the presentation. Mandy, are you able to see full slides, full screen on my slides again?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you all so much for participating in that activity and adding in, and we'll have a couple more Jamboard activities for us to keep going on there. But yeah, we're all seeing some issues pop up. We're all seeing priority areas that we would like to focus on for our students. So going back and thinking about assessment, what is driving the issues that we're seeing? What is driving some of those behaviors that we are seeing? I see a lot of empathy coming up. I see a lot of attendance coming up. I saw, a lot of things related to students and adults. So we know that we have priority issues, but what we really want to know is what is causing that? What is at the root there? What is really underneath that? So when we think about attendance, for example, there's so much more going on for students than just attendance. And I know we all know this, but it could be a lack of resources to get to school, a lack of school connectedness, not being involved in school, and sometimes just getting students more involved in an extracurricular activity or involved more in the school day, their attendance rates start to go up. It could be due to the school climate or environment. So all of that to say, every one of those behaviors that we are seeing on that Jamboard, we really want to know what is the root cause. And I will tell a little story that this really stuck out for me. So one of the times I was going in and teaching a prevention program in a school, I was going into a rural school, and this school actually had a lot or quite a few incidents with sexual violence going on. I was working with high school students. So I was going into that classroom, and I decided that I was going to do an entire unit on consent. So I was going to talk more about consent. What does that mean? What are healthy boundaries? And I had my 9-week lesson plan all out to the T. So I go in there and start teaching, start going through all of these topics. And it wasn't until my second day with my students that I had a young man raise his hand, and he said, "Miss, this is boring." And those high school students can be brutally honest sometimes, but it was the feedback that I needed to hear. And I said, Okay, so explain that a little bit more. Why do you think this is boring? And he said, we have been taught consent in this school, and we have been taught about boundaries since we were all in 8th grade. We all know all of this information that you're talking about. Well, that was news to me. I had no idea that they had been taught all of these things. And so I look around the class and I said, do you all know this stuff I'm talking about? And they all just started shaking their heads. They didn't want to tell me, I guess, before I got too far into the lesson. And so what I decided to do is a focus group with that class. My very next time, I threw away the lesson plans. I threw away the curriculum that I was going in there to do. And I said, you all tell me what you need. And so I went through this focus group toolkit, and you will see this, a link to how to do a focus group right here in these slides. And from this focus group, I was able to dig a little bit deeper, and students started opening up to me. They started telling me what was really going on. So we knew there was this issue of sexual violence. We knew this was happening in their community, but it wasn't until I actually started asking the questions that they let me know the real problem in their community was with gang violence. And they had such an issue going on with gang violence that I had no clue even existed, and even existed for these students. I'll never forget one young lady told me, if you talk to us about gang violence, we get this under control and we get some more skills in this area, you're going to see sexual violence rates go down. Again, something that I will never forget and has shifted how I think about prevention and how I've thought about building up skills in students from then on out. Ask the students what they need. When we are seeing behaviors, there's so much more going on beneath the surface, and we have to figure out what's actually going on beneath the surface. If you sat through a trauma-informed training of ours before, you've probably heard me say behaviors are external representation of what's happening internally for students. What's really at the core, what's really going on for them. And that is what this first task gets us to. So probably when you saw data on here, you didn't know I was going to go that deep with it, but it really is one of the most important pieces. So what can you do for data collection? You can do school climate surveys. And as you will see, if you click on the link, it will actually take you to our section on our State Department that you can see an elementary student survey, a secondary student survey, a staff school climate survey, and all of these different resources you can use for data collection. Now, there are many different areas that you can go, or many different websites that you can go for school climate survey, but these are just the ones that we have available on our link, and I highly encourage getting that out to every single one of your students. Now, when you have a school climate survey, like I said, with that focus group, this allowed me to dig a little bit deeper. What is actually going on for our students? And you may be sitting here thinking, that's a lot of work just to implement a program. But it's a lot of really important work. When we talk about prevention, lightening the load on us, we don't want to keep a heavy load because we're selecting programs that aren't relevant to our communities and aren't relevant to our students. So that's why this piece is really, really important. There's a link to how to do hotspot mapping. I recently did this with another school that I have been working with, and we had the results of hotspot mapping. And what this is students take a survey and let you know where most either bullying behavior or incidents are occurring in the school. I went over the results of these hotspot mapping with the staff, and before we went through the results, I asked them, where do you think the most incidents are occurring? And what the teachers thought versus what the students were saying where they're actually occurring were completely different locations. So the school was actually able to adjust their duty schedules. They were able to adjust the location of their personnel or their staff. So we had more staff actually in areas that we needed them. And there was more staff being bought into going to that area on duty because we actually knew this is where incidents were occurring for students. We also have parent and caregiver surveys, universal screening tools, staff assessments. I also encourage you to look at your local community data. So as you all know, you can participate for free in the Oklahoma Prevention Needs Assessment. This is through the Department of Mental Health. And this is something we highly encourage schools to participate in because it is a comprehensive needs assessment that will go through planning with your school of what your school is doing well and what your students need a little bit of extra support in. You can also participate in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and you can look at your county health rankings through this website here, countyhealthrankings.org. So you can look at community health overall within your school climate.
And I just want to note too, on some of these things that Elizabeth is referencing in terms of data collection tools, these are geared towards you, the youth respond. It's student voice and choice. It's that empowerment piece. And when we talk about being a trauma-informed school system, that's a major principle that applies. It's that voice and choice. They get to say, hey, these are the things that are occurring. Again, it's including that whole system approach.
So your second task as you walk through this is now we have our data. And we go in and we actually fill out what do we want our priority topic to be. How often are we seeing these things happen? Where is it most, who is most being affected? That's when we go into selecting our programs. So what I would first like to say or talk about is our recommendation for what programs you should be putting in place. So we recommend that any student K through 5 or pre-K through 5, early childhood, you focus on building up those social emotional skills. So any social emotional learning competencies, programs related to those skills, that is what we most recommend focusing on for those students, because we want to build up as many protective factors as possible, as early as possible. And SEL is the best way to build protective factors for students because we are giving them all of the skills that they need later in life. So if you would like to know more about those social emotional learning competencies or what those skills are, I highly encourage you to go back and watch the recording of the SEL competency piece that was recorded this morning. And Blair and Jenna, I know you're in the chat, so if you could put the name of your presentation and maybe the link to the Engage website that they can go back and watch that later. So we also want to say it is recommended any early childhood K through pre-K through 5 that we also touch on programs that talk about consent, boundaries, and sexual abuse or sexual violence prevention. So those are really the topics that we're looking at for that age group. Now, as we're moving grades 6 through 12th or around 5th through 12th, 6th through 12th, that's when you really start getting into topic-based prevention programs. So selecting prevention programs based off of what students are going through at your school. So we start looking at either dating violence. We can start looking at substance abuse programs at that time, sexual education programs at that time. So more of that topic-based prevention. We want to make sure that students are getting that information around that time. Now, that does not mean that we stop with SEL. We recommend doing both topic-based prevention and social emotional learning together right there in one. So if you're asking me how in the world do I select a program, I don't even know where to begin. We have a list of national registries for you to select from right here. So I'm going to quickly just walk you through CASEL because they have a really great program guide for schools to walk through. And CASEL is where you can find all social emotional learning competencies and standards and different programs that they have. Okay, so you can click on right here, Explore All SEL Programs, and it will take you to this database of every social emotional learning program that exists. So you can click on, I am working with middle school students, And I want to do in my classroom, and I am in an urban setting. So you can go through and look at different evaluation outcomes, everything that you would like in this sort and filter. So as you can see, 77 different programs just pop up just with those few filters. So I can go and drive down even further, say, I'm in 7th grade. I want something that's lesson-based, something that has an online resource of library, and then that gets us down a little bit further. If you would like help with selecting programs, if you would like help with how to use these national registries, all of these different things you would need to know about what is working, what's working in schools that you see, please reach out to our team. We are more than happy to work with you all and to go through this process and let you know what programs we're seeing work really well, how to drive down into your needs and really look at what you need. What Works Clearinghouse is another great place to go to look at different programs. So I do see a question in the chat, how much do these programs cost? And there is a wide variety, but on most of those filters, you can select at no cost. And we do have a list of free programs and free resources out there for you too. I do just want to quickly mention while we are on here, and I did not add a slide in about this, that you can use Title IV funding in schools to pay for prevention programs. So there is school funding out there that does exist to purchase prevention programs. Do you have something, Mandy?
Well, at that, and I just wanted to mention too that I know some schools have used some of their ESSER funding in terms of those social, emotional, or mental health components to get in some more of those evidence-based programs and for their counselors to use or even their teachers.
I just realized looking at this slide that the RMC Health link is not on here. And it is a free resource of free lesson plans. So I will make sure and go back in and link that into these slides so you can have access to those free resources. And I am happy to send you out the list of free lesson plans, free prevention programs that exist for you.
Do you want to have participants kind of list some of the data sources they're currently using? Or if they have any at their schools, or just, you know, formal,
yes, yeah.
informal. I know that's on that jam board, but I didn't know if that was something that we wanted participants to, work on before they went into this program piece.
Yes, let's click back over to our jam board. So if you are still on that link, if you don't mind going in here, and what data sources or what resources do you have within your school or in your classroom that you're brainstorming right now that I'm thinking through, I could potentially use this, and maybe here are some other resources that we didn't mention that we can share with everybody that you're thinking right now how you can do this.
Right, and go ahead and list both those qualitative and quantitative. Maybe you're a teacher that asked those kiddos if there's anything that you wanted me to know, kind of that sticky note inventory, just like we did. So however it is you collect the data.
I will put the link back in the chat just in case. Oh, you already got it. You're a step ahead of me.
You're thinking the same thing.
Universal Screener is great. Awesome. Yep. Teacher recommendations. Yeah. Okay, great. And so just for the sake of time, I will switch back over to our slides, but please keep putting in your data collection tools that your schools currently has, or some that you're thinking of right now that you could be using or that you might use, that you see a link in this presentation to or in this guide to. And we go back and we use this information, and this becomes almost our evaluation tool as well. So it's very helpful when y'all are putting information in here. Okay, so step 3 is program training. So this walks schools or classrooms through, how do I get trained on this program? Not every single program that you select is going to have a training required or a training associated with it. So this just might look like, how do I get familiar with the program? How do I get familiar with these lesson plans and go through and see how I can incorporate some of these strategies into my existing lesson plans? So some things to be thinking about is just write out what did we select? What program did we think about? When are we going to train on this? And if it is for your entire district, when are we going to train the staff on this? When are we going to train just our school climate team or our safe and healthy team or whatever team you have at your school? And what plan do we have in place to train any new staff? And then if you are implementing this in your classroom, what is my training outline? What does my implementation outline look like? When am I going to review all of this material? So just making sure we are comfortable, we have reviewed the lesson plans, and we know how we want to incorporate that into our classroom. Okay, so now step 2, moving on to building capacity. So how do we make sure we have everything we need in place and we are building capacity across our entire classroom, our entire school, or our district? So this is something that is so important and such a crucial step that I ask schools, do not skip this step if you do any of them. It's taking an inventory of your current initiatives and aligning your initiatives. Cannot tell you how many times I have either been sitting in professional development or I have given professional development that I've heard the phrase, another initiative. You want me to do what now? You're training me on something else. So we want to prevent that as much as possible. And we want to make sure we are aligning everything and taking an inventory of what we are currently doing. Because like I said, if we don't have data behind initiatives we already have in place, if I'm just doing a DARE program, or I'm throwing in a lifeline suicide training, or I have all of these other prevention programs that don't really have a rhyme or reason, that's when we really see that staff burnout. So how do we align what we are doing? And I am going to, here is a link in these slides for you to go back and use this inventory alignment tool. And I'm going to let Mandy talk through how we have aligned some initiatives even within our school climate team.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I went ahead and dropped the link. It's a forced copy, but it is one that you can go back and use at your site. I just real quickly, I know we're kind of wrapping up on time here, but just to kind of show you, this is an exemplar of how this tool has been used at other sites. So it's really kind of self-explanatory. We sit down as a team and we say, okay, what are we currently using? And in this school, they're using Second Step. They have a new teacher training on classroom management. They have PBIS implemented. They also, one of the things they wrote down was crisis plan, but right here, you'll notice they don't know how often they look at their crisis plan or when it should be delivered. And what you do here, just really, it's you write it down. Who's the person responsible for delivering it? Is that your teacher, your school counselor, your school climate team? What's the decision rules? Decision rules being, do all students have access to this? Or is it based off of maybe what grade span you're in? Or is it based off of maybe your office discipline referrals? What are those decision rules? How does the student receive the service, and how does the service discontinue? How do they service discontinue? Progress monitoring. What do you do to monitor that particular program or practice? Do you just look at your office disciplinary referrals? Do you look at your school climate surveys? Do you have an evaluation with your second step programs? And what's that fidelity of implementation? Meaning that fidelity of implementation, if I walk through your school tomorrow and you tell me that you're practicing positive behavior interventions and supports, how will I know that? What are things that I will see? What are things that I hear? And you go through that and you do it at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And really, it's just a resource tool. The great thing about the things that we create, you can make it yours. You can make it specific for your school site or district. Anything I missed there with that tool?
No, not at all. I think that's perfect. Thank you. So I really, what we want to get across to schools with this tool is once you see it on paper and you start really looking at why are we doing the things, is just because we've always done it that way, or do we really have a why behind every initiative we have in our school? That's when we really start seeing some of those shifts in talking about aligning that to the overall school climate. We want to make sure there's a why behind everything we're doing, but we also have to communicate that why. We have to let the entire staff know. We have to let our students know, why are we focusing on this in Miss Sutta's classroom? Why am I focusing on this in our entire district? So it's really important that we take the time to do this step and really look at our why, really look at the number of initiatives that we have in our school building. Okay, step 3, planning. So this is where we really start digging into the social ecological model. And this is one of my most favorite models to walk through when we are program planning, because it takes a comprehensive approach. We are going beyond what we need to do for students, and we are looking at every single aspect within our school, in our community. So what is the social ecological model? So it is a public health model, but it is a public health model that has been researched and shown to be effective to elicit behavior change. So what we know is if you focus on even 3 out of these 5 levels that you see here on our screen, you are more likely to elicit behavior change from individuals. So you're wanting to see student behavior change around a particular area. Implementing the social ecological model is a great way to do so. It makes things very black and white. How are we hitting? Make sure we are hitting every single area that we need to. So one of the first things we look at is individual knowledge. How do we build up the knowledge of students and staff? So this is really looking at programs. What programs do we have in place? So the next area of the model is looking at relationships. How do we make sure we're modeling effective relationships? How do we make sure we have positive relationships, not only with our students, but with our other staff members as well, and positive peer-to-peer relationships. So we're looking at relationships as a whole in the entire school or in our entire classroom. So with any prevention planning, we want to make sure we have a school-wide approach as well. So we're not just saying, students, you need to know this, and you're going to learn this every 4th hour in English, but our entire school building is saying this is important. The example I often use is if you walk into a football school, you know it's a football school. You know that they are proud of that and they are proud to be a football school. It should be the same exact thing if we have a school who is focused on bullying. We walk into that school and you can just feel it all around you. We are focusing on empathy. We take bullying seriously, and we build up others in our school, and we have compassion for others. So it's walking in, and this is really that school climate piece to the model. So the community aspect goes back to that family and community engagement guide that Mandy shared in that technical assistance tool that she shared earlier in the chat as well. And then the 5th area that we want to focus on, and this is the highest sphere of influence, but that is policy. And it can be policy in our classroom, or it can be policy in our entire school or our entire district. So we know that policy alone doesn't elicit behavior change, but when policy is in combination with all of these other things, it is a very crucial component. So how do we have effective policies in place, and how do we have equitable policies in place? And we have a great tool for you all to use as well. And I'll make sure that I include the link to that of how do we assess equitable policies for all students. So that's when in the guide you will start working through this planning matrix. So what are we going to be doing at that individual level? How do we focus on changing and shifting attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs? And what strategies do we have? And a lot of times action steps here are going back to that program that you are selecting. So the program that you are selecting as well from that national registry will also look at relationships, but how do we promote healthy interaction modeling? So a lot of these strategies are actually giving you examples of how to do this, but you will just walk through and complete what the action steps are for our school or for my classroom. And again, it just walks you through each level of the SEM. So this is an example of a comprehensive prevention program in a school that I have worked in before. And I just took this same planning matrix and turned it into what group do we want to make sure we focus on. So from our data and from our needs, we know we really needed to do some faculty and staff training. So we listed out when we would be doing that training and what curriculum we would be using, and then what level of the SEM that it related to. So we also knew what we wanted to do with students, what classrooms we were going to be implementing this program in with students. We knew we wanted in a fall core class. This is actually a high school program that we have done. We also knew that we wanted to do a spring core class and a spring school assembly. So I do want to make sure and just say this, it wouldn't be my prevention speech without saying one-time assemblies do not change behaviors. And that is something really important to hear as well. We cannot just do one-time assemblies and think that we're going to shift any type of behaviors in students. But one-time assemblies are really great when they're paired with all of these other activities as well. So if you're going to kick off whatever session you have or whatever topic you're focusing on with a school assembly, and also follow up with some multi-session lessons in schools, that's where we really start to see the shift in behaviors. So you can just go through this entire guide or this example. You see we hit on every level of the SEM, and we really made sure this was a full school approach. So how could this look different in a classroom as well? So when you're planning for implementation, you really want to think through your strategic plan. Who is going to implement the program? If it's in my classroom, it might be me. You can either do peer education, have some of your students do some of the lesson plans if they feel comfortable with that and they have training beforehand. We need schools to think about which classroom will get the program and what school or what the program schedule will look like. So that's where in the prevention guide, you will walk through each one of these things. How do we plan out the programs and how do we make sure this is in every setting across the board? Okay, so stage 4 in implementation. So we're almost there. We're almost at the end. We're at the crucials. This is where all of the work is actually happening. Beyond the planning side and beyond the preparation side, we're actually ready to implement the program with students. So if you can tell, we spent almost an hour and a half on this session, just getting up to implementation. That is because implementation is really giving that information, But everything that goes in before that is so crucial. And there are all such crucial steps to make sure we're getting implementation right and to make sure that your valuable time as educators is used effectively. Because that is one thing that I have never heard an educator say is, I have plenty of time to do this. Yeah, load it on. I have a ton of all the time in the world. So we want to make sure all of the steps beforehand are leading up, that your time is being used effectively and implementation is occurring strategically and in a way that most students will get the most benefit. So if you do select a program that comes with lesson plans that tells you every single thing, you will get a script, how to say exactly what you need to say, what activities to do, even what materials you will need to implement activities. I really want to make sure we hit on the fact that you can adapt these programs. You can adapt SEL programs, you can adapt prevention programs, and you should adapt them for your community. Again, going back to that cultural sensitivity. So you can adapt anything as long as the fidelity remains. As long as the core intent of the program is remaining, you can go through and describe how much, in what ways, and how the program or practice is changed to meet the needs of your school. Again, going back to fidelity, here are some of those 3 core elements that you have to make sure you keep intact. Preserve the setting, as well as the number and the length of sessions. So if it is a 10-week program, making sure you're not doing all 10 programs or all 10 lessons in 1 or 2 days, really making sure you are sticking to the length of the sessions, because that is something that is really important to the effectiveness of learning for students. That the key program content is learned and that the guidance and the research stays the same. Again, always going back to your community context. And then evaluation. There are 2 different types of evaluation to look at: process evaluation and outcome evaluation. Process is this working? Am I implementing with fidelity? Do I have all of my students who have received these lessons? This is going to be occurring over the length of implementation. Your outcome evaluation is actually looking at, did this make an impact? Did I actually change any student behavior? And making sure we are collecting the data to look at that. So here's an example of what a process evaluation can look like, as well as an outcome evaluation. So this might look like pre-post test, doing a post assessment with your students, again, going back and doing those focus groups, some sort of evaluation form, looking at your office discipline referrals, looking at your attendance records, just making sure that you are seeing some measurable change by implementing the program. Okay, I got all the way through evaluation with 2 minutes to spare. I didn't think I had it in me, but here we are. And I just want to quickly share, you've probably seen this in other Engage sessions. We have a new website for you all to go and look at, talking about recovery, going back into school, getting ready together to go into this next school year. I highly encourage you to look through this website and look through the guidance documents and resources that we have for you all as teachers and as school leaders. And I also want to quickly just pop in the chat our evaluation survey. We would greatly appreciate you going in and evaluating the session so we can practice what we preach and really look at the data and see how it is best meeting the needs of our audience. Mandy or Blair or anyone, if you have a link to that, if you could just put it in the chat. And I am going to stop talking for the last 30 seconds and stop our recording so you all can come on off mute or enter any questions that you may have in the chat. Thank you all so much for bearing with us and being together with us on this beautiful afternoon. I greatly appreciate your time that you spend with us. And like I said, I will be here and Mandy will be here to answer any questions that you may have now.